Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Deep State. Our show today is entitled A Catholic Murder Mystery. Here in America, it's the 4th of July, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. So, we're going to talk about a very obscure case that has very interesting connections, perhaps to the President of the United States and even the Vatican. And so it's sort of an under the radar case. It happens down here in the part of the world that I live in. So I was presented with this case this week and I thought I'd share it with everybody. If you're living outside of America, it's our July 4th here. And I do thank all of you people from around the world for joining us here on Dr. Deep State. So I want to do a quick rehash of a few of the shows we had over on our Locals channel. We do 3 shows every week on Locals. We have a Metaverse Monday, a Connect the Dots Wednesday, and a Memory Hold Friday. So I want to do a quick recap for our shows for you. On Monday, we revisited a topic that we developed the week before, thinking about a psyop nature to the wars and rumors of wars, and so deeper agenda. And of course, one of the things we're always tapping into here is the ancient agenda, the ancient enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, that in our time we see typologically as the church and the synagogue and the enmity. So we try to be aware of that enmity, the modus operandi of the synagogue against the church. It includes infiltration, deception, and controlling the narrative. So with that in mind, we're trying to find a central thread of what's going on in the world today. And we juxtaposed on Metaverse Monday. That's where we tap into parts of the book In Pursuit of the Metaverse and connect it to events going on in the world today. We make the case from chapter 4 that the fullness of reality was manifest in Christian empire. And this reality we can see is sacramental, historical, and hierarchical. And we juxtapose that with the now manifesting Lubavitch Empire or the J Empire, which tries to invert the Christian sacramentality, the Christian hierarchy, and the Christian sacraments. And so we looked at that on Monday, and then on our show on Wednesday, we connected that to how the synagogue plays ball in this enmity, this war against the church, and it does it through means of deception, which is actually the motto. We get into that, the motto of these interconnected alphabet agencies. And it's, I think, once you see that, you see how that's manifesting in these wars and rumors of wars. But we actually went into some really touchy subjects on Wednesday and on Friday. Everything from concepts of poisoning the well and ultimately the Inquisition and how that plays out. But beyond the wars and rumors of wars, one of the central threads is this Palantir piece, because we see part of the ancient agenda is to enslave Christians and indeed humanity. And what seems to be happening is the high-tech world is now using these resources to do and implement a biometric Noahide slave system. And I think it's healthy to be aware of that. And we know from what happened 5 years ago, in some ways it could be a very good thing to be aware of how this is being rolled out and how we could be objects of this deception. So we talked a little bit about, from scripture, about the false system that is now coming about, and played around with that idea a little bit. We went into the men in black and the true Illuminati, and really thought about the ultimate agenda seems to be that it's unavoidable that when the United States is being increasingly asked to go to war with China and Russia and it within the Middle East, all at the same time, one of the agendas seems to be the depletion of all of the parties involved. In other words, the destruction, the utter destruction. So we considered that same agenda, both from the West and from the East, and how many of those things are being marked out. And we included in there, again, touchy subjects like poisoning the well, connecting to many of the connections with pharmaceuticals, the air and the food and so forth. And we looked at this interesting alliance and connecting it with Palantir. Throughout the Middle East, this is going strong. Throughout the East, the West, the BRICS, you have to see this Palantir piece of the biometric slave system and this new accord, this new ecumenical order that's being developed. So we talked about that Monday and especially on Wednesday. And today we finished this off on Memory Hole Friday with a reading through a Jewish scholar's perspective. And that was from a book from 1946, Harvard Press. And we went into that and connected back all the dots from the week. So that's a little bit of a rehash from some of the things that we did this week. And now I am going to get us started with the presentation on the murder mystery. And where I would like to begin now is with the mystery of this individual here. And I thought I'd do something different. It's, again, light and fun. In the 1990s and the 2000s, I used to watch all these murder programs. I teach law, international law, constitutional. So all these cases intrigued me, and I taught criminal justice. And so I used to watch many of these shows, and I'd never heard of this one. And a student presented it to me. I think I'd vaguely heard of it, but she did a presentation, and I'm basically going to show you her presentation today. But the reason some of this doesn't get out, in part, is because I live in sort of a black hole of America, and it's called the Rio Grande Valley. So I thought I'd just have this as an opportunity to say the part of the world I live in. And it's the context of this murder mystery that takes place in 1960. So again, your mind might be thinking, who is about to become president? What's going on? What's about to be rolled out at the Vatican? And that this case seems to have a conspiracy thread. I'll leave some of you can ponder how strong that thread is. But where we live today in the Rio Grande Valley, even a lot of people in the great state of Texas are unaware of this. This murder case is going to happen in McAllen, Texas. And for people that are not aware, nowadays we call this the Deep South of Texas. And it's I live in the Rio Grande Valley. The area in Texas down there in red is called the Rio Grande Valley. A lot of people in Texas don't even know. It's really just a forgotten spot. So it goes from, more or less the McAllen area down there to the Gulf. There's roughly 2 million people, but it's kind of famous for being a black hole in terms of census information. So we know there's over 1 million, and we suspect there's about 2 million people down here. And today, the demographics, it's statistically the least diverse area in America. So you have to think about some real white spots up there in the north, like North Dakota or Vermont. It's less diverse than that. So most people down here are bilingual. The most dominant operative language when you in homes and even out and about is Spanish. So that's a little idea of the demographics today, although it was a bit different in 1960. And I think that's a little bit, even people in Texas sometimes don't know about this, but there's a beautiful beach resort area called South Padre at the tip of this. And that's That's the piece that I have for you. Just getting you thinking about this part of the world we call the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Now, for the murder mystery. It was presented this week by one of my students down here. And a lot of our court cases or criminal cases that the students present tend to focus on a lot of international, oftentimes drug-related crime cases, but we get all kinds of crime cases from all over Texas. And this is the first time I'd heard of this one. And the reason I'm presenting it to you is this thread at the end that this case seemingly could thread to the highest levels of power, perhaps even including the men in black. So the case involves the murder of Irene Garza. And the year is 1960. So she was born down here in the valley in 1934. She was raised in McAllen, Texas, and graduated from McAllen High School. By the way, before I get started, the demographics back then would be roughly 50% Anglo and 50% Hispanic. She was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart in 1958 and Homecoming Queen at Pan American College, now called the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. She was a second grade teacher at the time of her death and was a member of the Legion of Mary and took her Catholic faith very seriously. According to family, she regularly attended confession every Saturday and church every Sunday. So the location of this is the Sacred Heart Church in downtown McAllen. On April 16th, 1960, the Holy Saturday, Irene had told her parents she would be going to Sacred Heart Church for confession. Witnesses say they saw Irene in line of confession at 7 p.m. Witnesses also say they saw Irene walking to the rectory with Father John Faget around 7:30. And I'll give you some additional sources that I kind of pulled out and that my student pulled out, that many people were whispering that they thought that was incredibly strange, that he picked her out and took her to the rectory. It was highly unusual, and people made a public note of it. And she was never seen again. Her parents grew worried after realizing Irene had not come home yet and reported her missing at 3 a.m. to the McAllen PD. The body was discovered. They found her body fully clothed with her blouse unbuttoned and her underwear missing. Autopsy revealed that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted while unconscious, and the main cause of death was asphyxiation. 2 weeks later, authorities drained the canal and found a photo slide viewer, which they believe was used to wrap around her body to prevent her from floating. Okay. Evidence. The authorities decided to turn to the public in hope of finding the owner of the view slider. 2 days later, they received a letter from John Faget, the priest, saying the photo viewer was his. And I have to pause at that. There was no fingerprints discovered at the site, but the fact that he would admit that the device used was his is a point that's worth making at this point. John Faget, that's Father John Faget, was questioned by authorities and charged up his he changed up the story several times during the investigation, in the pre-trial and the initial interrogation. So he was constantly switching his story. Later, he said he did hear the confession. So he said, I didn't even know her. I didn't do confession. Then he said he did do confession. Later, said he did hear confession in the rectory and left her, but no witnesses saw her come out. Their attention was drawn to him, and he became the primary suspect. Who was John Faget? John was born in Chicago, Illinois on November 22nd, 1932. He was raised in a traditional German Catholic household. In 1946, at the age of 13, his parents sent him off to an all-boys school in San Antonio, Texas. He attended the all-male college and studied at the missionary of the Mary Immaculate before becoming an ordained Catholic priest on September 8th, 1958. In doing so, he accepted a vow of celibacy. Due to the shortage of priests in the Rio Grande Valley, Faget was transferred to McAllen, Texas, to begin a year of pastoral training. So another woman comes forward. Maria Guerrara had been attacked at a nearby church, said the suspect came up behind her and tried to stuff a rag in her mouth. So just FYI, the neighboring church is the church that I attend. So it was another reason I was kind of drawn into the story. She was able to escape him by biting his finger. Said the suspect was wearing priest clothing. A year after Irene's murder, she identified John Faget from a police lineup as her attacker. In 1962, John stood trial for attempted rape, but the jury deadlocked. Rather than face another trial, Faget pleaded no contest to a lesser charge of aggravated assault and was fined $500. So this case occurred before the murder. And another one, Beatrice Garza. Beatrice Garcia reported a bizarre encounter with John Faget a few weeks before Irene's murder. She said Faget stopped her from walking and asked if he could take some pictures of her dressed in black by the cemetery. She later testified in trial. The case grew cold. In 1963, Father John was moved to many monasteries, not just one. So before I continue, I think one of the things that we're getting a sense of, we've heard so many stories about sexual cover-ups in roughly the last 30 years, and some have speculated it's part of an externalization to make the church look bad. Other people said it was about time, so there's both good and bad things associated with this, but sometimes we don't think of cover-ups as much in this time frame. So after disappearing the area, the case grew cold. So he had actually served at many monasteries, and there was always hanky-panky going on, and he would get shifted from one monastery to another. So a former monk comes forward. The case was reopened decades later by a former monk named Dale Techny. Dale was a former monk at the Assumption Abbey in Missouri in 1963, where Father John was sent for counseling. And again, he was always getting in trouble at all of these monasteries. So in 2002, he sent a letter to San Antonio, the San Antonio PD, saying he had information about the death of a woman in the 1960s on Easter. Before I continue, and my student had stressed this, she went in a little bit deeper, that he'd heard this confession, he'd been sitting on it for a couple decades, and he couldn't deal with it anymore. So he came forward. He was told by the superiors to counsel a young priest named Father John who had killed someone. One of the courses of the many months, Father John told Techney about the attack and murder. Texas Rangers picked up the case from San Antonio. Enter Father O'Brien. Texas Ranger Judy Jarmillo tracked down Father Joseph O'Brien, who was assistant pastor at Sacred Heart Church in the 1960s. He recorded an interview with Father O'Brien where he talks about Father John confessing to him in the 1960s. Father O'Brien and Dale Techney, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, you don't have to correct me, Techney, stories both matched up. So now you have independent yet corroborating stories about this confession. District Attorney Guerrera, enter now 2002. He believed that Father John never confessed to either of them and refused to take the case to a grand jury. Why, I ask? Is there pressure being put on him? In 2004, Guerrera finally gave in from public pressure and took the case to a grand jury, but the grand jury did not charge Father John. Finally, a campaign of promise in 2014. After 32 years, the district attorney, Rene Guerrera, loses the campaign to Ricardo Rodriguez. Ricardo Rodriguez promises Irene's family to look into Irene Garza's case. He was arrested, Father John. In February 2016, the former priest, John Faget, was arrested. He was brought back to Texas from Arizona to stand trial. Father John's trial began late in November 2017. Dale Techney testified about Faget's confession to him in 1963. Beatrice Garza and Maria Guerrara testified. Father Joseph O'Brien passed away in 2005, but his interview recording was mentioned in trial. Okay, here is the point that I wanted to bring up today, and I'll show you a quick video as well. So in Father John's trial, Father Thomas Doyle, who ran an expert witness on clergy abuse, testifying a letter between church members and authorities. In the letter, he expressed how the case might affect the church, also the campaign of Catholic presidential candidate John F. Kennedy. Authorities believed John Faget was protected by the hierarchy of the church by attempting to cover the case. So my student pulled a thread, and I pulled a little bit more, that leads all the way up to the Vatican and the proceedings of what we call Vatican II. And the bizarre part of this is that in order to roll out possibly Vatican II, hierarchies of the church, and now we can get into Men in Black and the architects of Vatican II, and whether this is the church or the synagogue who's got the power to come into the DA's office and say, no, look the other way. That's real power. Perhaps the power of the synagogue, or people could say that was entrenched enough in 1960 that the hierarchy of the church could come all the way down to little bitty McAllen, Texas, and say to secular authorities, look the other way, sit on it. Off the record meetings, Daryl Davis was a former reporter in the 1960s and covered the American Guerrara plea, testified about an off-record meeting between reporters and the district attorney at the time, says he remembered saying, we know that Father killed Irene Garza and the church knows it. They made arrangements that in exchange for the plea of the Guerrara case, Father John would not be prosecuted in the Irene Garza case, and the church would send him away to a monastery for quote unquote disturbed and troubled priests. The verdict and the sentencing. The verdict and the sentencing. On December 7th, 2017, after 6 days, the jury came down with a verdict and found John Faget guilty of the offense of murder and malice of forethought. The jury sentenced him to life in prison, and Father John died in prison 3 years later. And so the intrigue is that thread, conspiracy question mark. Personally, I do see a church cover-up, but the fact or the idea that it could reach the idea that there were powers that wanted John F. Kennedy in place, and we now suspect, many of us in the deep state world, that these deep powers were both there in getting him elected and eliminating him. So very interesting, but we could step back even another step and think about the proceedings of Vatican II and the idea that there would be, from that height of Catholic power, a call to cover up this case is at the very least intriguing. So I want to leave you with just a little bit of a video clip so you can see some little context outside of the presentation I've just given you. Make sure the volume is on. And here we go.
Not part of Irene Garza's family, but the story of her 1960 murder has been part of the history of McAllen, Texas for generations.
It kind of grew of legend about a girl that, went to confession and, never left.
Irene was accomplished and admired. She went to college, graduate school, and became a school teacher. She went to church regularly, and that's where she was last seen. Following a massive search, her body was discovered in a canal. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and suffocated. Police had grown suspicious of the 27-year-old priest when he said a viewfinder found at the crime scene was his. Faget also gave different accounts about that night, and he had some injuries from the night Irene disappeared.
Scratches that ran vertically down his hands and on the top of his arms.
Despite the evidence, the case grew cold. Years passed. There were rumors that some type of deal had been made between the church and authorities, but there was never definitive proof. Until now, says the prosecutor.
The state calls Daryl Davis.
Daryl Davis is one of the key witnesses. He was a television reporter at the time of Irene's murder, and he says there was an off-the-record meeting with the then DA, Robert Lattimore.
He said, we know that Father Faget killed Irene Garza, and the church knows that he killed Irene Garza. He said the church is going to put him in a monastery for disturbed or troubled priests, and he will be kept there for the rest of his life.
You won't hear evidence of corruption. What you will hear is...
So again, when I pulled on that thread, the connections were made, allegations that it went all the way up to the Vatican. So I'm going to leave the story there, and you all can speculate on it. But I wish people in America happy 4th, and people around the world, thank you so much for being here with us today. This has been Dr. Deep State.